Police attacked elderly black man in courtroom. Minutes later, he took the judge's seat. The handcuffs bit into Samuel Harris's wrists hard enough to leave marks. At 68 years old, he never imagined he'd end the day being dragged through the marble hallway of the very courthouse where he'd worked for 3 decades. "Animals like you don't belong here," Officer Davis spat, shoving Samuel against the cold wall. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. His leather briefcase hit the floor, scattering legal documents across the courthouse steps like macabre confetti. Samuel tasted the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. The officer's open palm slap had been hard enough to snap his head sideways. Through blurred vision, he could read the bronze plaque above the main entrance, County Court of Justice, honoring the law since 1952. 3 decades serving this building. 3 decades dedicated to justice. And now he was being brutalized just 6 meters from his own courtroom door. "Officer Davis, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Samuel tried to explain, his voice calm despite the throbbing pain in his jaw. "If you could just verify my identification." "Shut up." Davis twisted Samuel's arm backward with unnecessary force. "You people always have an excuse. Always claim to be someone important. Lawyer, judge, senator." He laughed with disdain. "I've seen this act before." 2 other officers, Rodriguez and Thompson, gathered around with their cell phones raised, filming and laughing. Humiliation was part of the show. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. 40 years ago, he had taken an oath. For the past 6 months, he'd been investigating something that was now materializing before his eyes with disturbing clarity. The universe had a cruel sense of irony. "This guy's dressed like a homeless man trying to infiltrate," Thompson commented, recording from another angle. "Bet he was trying to steal something." Samuel wore simple khaki pants and a light blue button-down shirt, his usual clothes on Saturdays when he preferred to work without the formality of judicial robes. No one recognized him without the attire that defined his authority. "Listen here, old man," Davis brought his face close to Samuel's, breath hot and threatening. "You trespassed on government property. You're carrying documents you clearly stole from some office. And when questioned, you became aggressive and disrespectful to authority." "That's not true," Samuel responded firmly, his eyes meeting the officer's without blinking. "You didn't even give me a chance to explain before." Another violent shove against the wall cut off his words. Samuel's head hit the marble with a dull sound that echoed through the corridor. Stars danced in his vision. "You know what your problem is," Davis hissed. "People like you think you can go anywhere, do whatever you want. But not in my courthouse. Here, you learn your place." "My courthouse," Samuel noted mentally. What an interesting choice of words. The officer pulled Samuel through familiar corridors, past portraits of previous judges Samuel had known personally, past commemorative plaques he himself had inaugurated, through hallways where he'd walked thousands of times with his head held high and everyone's respect. Now he was just another suspect being dragged into a courtroom. As they pushed him through the double doors, Samuel saw the bench where he usually sat. Saw his own name engraved on the identification plate, obscured by distance and angle. Saw the gavel he'd used for decades resting in its usual place. And he saw temporary Judge Harrison, a pale man in his 60s, already seated in his chair, presiding over his courtroom. "Your Honor," Davis began in a solemn, rehearsed voice, "I intercepted this individual attempting to breach courthouse security. He was acting suspiciously, carrying confidential documents, and refused to provide adequate identification." Samuel observed the room. The stenographer, Helen Morrison, who'd worked there for 15 years. The clerk Robert Chun, whom he himself had trained. Prosecutor Alice Brennan, who'd argued before him hundreds of times. All present. None recognized him without his robes and in his current position of humiliation. Or perhaps they simply didn't want to see. "When I attempted to question the suspect," Davis continued his carefully constructed narrative, "he became verbally aggressive and physically threatening. I was forced to use minimum necessary force to ensure public safety." Minimum force, Samuel thought, feeling blood slowly trickling from the corner of his mouth. His cheek was already beginning to swell. What Officer Davis didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Samuel Harris wasn't just another victim of police abuse. He was the presiding judge of this courthouse for 3 decades. He was the man who, for the past 6 months, had been conducting a federal investigation into systematic patterns of police misconduct in the department. And Officer Davis was at the top of his list. 43 cases over the past 5 years. 43 times Davis had testified in his courtroom. And Samuel had documented every inconsistency, every suspicious pattern, every sign of racial bias that appeared repeatedly in the officer's testimony. Now, sitting handcuffed in the defendant's chair of his own courtroom, blood in his mouth and dignity trampled, Samuel Harris did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a smile of defeat or madness, but the calm smile of someone who knows exactly how the story will end. The smile of someone who's been preparing for this moment for months, even without knowing it would be so personal. Officer Davis misinterpreted that smile. Think it's funny, old man? You'll find it less funny when you're serving time. Officer Davis, Samuel said calmly, his voice carrying an authority that seemed incongruous coming from a handcuffed, bleeding man. Are you absolutely certain you want to continue with this narrative? It was the first time Davis hesitated. Something in Samuel's tone, in the way he spoke, made the officer feel an inexplicable chill run down his spine. Is that a threat? Davis asked, but his voice had lost some of its previous confidence. No, officer. It's an opportunity. Samuel looked directly into the man's eyes. A last chance to do the right thing. The moment passed. Davis turned to Judge Harrison with renewed arrogance. See, Your Honor? Threatening behavior. Exactly what I reported. Samuel leaned back in the uncomfortable defendant's chair, his hands still handcuffed, and watched the theater unfold. Soon, very soon, everyone in that room would understand the true meaning of justice. And Officer Davis would learn that some people don't need judicial robes to command a courtroom. Some people carry authority in every word, every gesture, every moment of dignity maintained even under the most degrading circumstances. If this story of injustice transformed into justice touched you, if you've witnessed or lived moments where the system failed before correcting itself, subscribe to this channel. Because what's about to happen in this courtroom will prove that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply being who you really are. Officer Davis straightened his uniform and cleared his throat, settling into the comfortable rhythm of a performance he'd perfected over 15 years. This was his stage, his script, his guaranteed victory. Your Honor, he began, his voice carrying practiced sincerity, I was conducting routine security protocols at approximately 9:15 this morning when I observed this individual acting suspiciously near the courthouse entrance. Judge Harrison leaned forward with interest. Please describe what you observed, Officer Davis. The defendant was dressed inappropriately for court proceedings, carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents. When I approached to investigate, he became immediately hostile. Samuel sat perfectly still, his face a mask of calm despite the throbbing pain in his jaw. He was taking mental notes of every lie, every fabrication, every detail that would soon unravel Davis's career. Hostile in what manner? Harrison inquired. Davis's eyes gleamed as he warmed to his narrative. He refused to show identification, claimed he had a right to be here without proper credentials, and when I attempted to verify his story, he became verbally abusive. Using profanity, making threats against my person. The stenographer's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every lie for posterity. Helen Morrison had worked in this courthouse long enough to know Samuel Harris by sight, but from her angle, with his face swollen and his usual dignified bearing replaced by the slumped posture of the handcuffed, perhaps she genuinely didn't recognize him. Or perhaps the system had trained her, like so many others, to see what she was told to see. Officer Rodriguez, Prosecutor Brennan called, can you corroborate Officer Davis's testimony? Rodriguez stood, his uniform pressed to perfection. Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident. The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent security protocols. Officer Davis handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. Samuel made a mental note. Rodriguez had arrived at least 5 minutes after the assault began. His testimony was perjury, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences. The defendant kept insisting he was someone important, Davis continued, his voice dripping with disdain. Claimed he worked here, that we'd made a terrible mistake. But Your Honor, I've been a law enforcement officer for 15 years. I know the difference between a legitimate courthouse employee and someone running a con. Judge Harrison nodded sympathetically. These situations can be delicate. And the alleged assault, Officer Davis? The defendant's injuries are quite visible. Davis's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Your Honor, I used only the force necessary to subdue an individual who was physically resisting lawful commands. The defendant's injuries, if any, resulted from his own choice to fight against proper authority. He pulled out his phone, swiping to a video. I have partial footage here. Unfortunately, my body camera experienced a technical malfunction this morning. The lie rolled off his tongue like honey. Samuel's slight smile deepened. Davis had forgotten about the courthouse's comprehensive security system. Cameras positioned every 15 feet, recording everything in high definition, with automatic cloud backup that no malfunction could erase. Your Honor, if I may speak, Samuel said quietly. The defendant will have his opportunity later. Harrison dismissed him with a wave. Continue, Officer Davis. Davis pulled himself taller. What we're seeing here is a classic case of someone playing the victim after being caught breaking the law. He trespassed on government property, carried suspicious documents, and when confronted with his criminal behavior, immediately claimed discrimination. Prosecutor Brennan nodded. Officer Davis, in your 15 years of service, have you encountered similar situations? Unfortunately, yes. There's a disturbing pattern. Davis's voice rose with righteous indignation. Certain individuals believe they're above the law, that rules don't apply to them. They use false accusations of racism to deflect from their own criminal behavior. It's honestly insulting to real victims of discrimination. Samuel felt a cold anger settle in his chest. For 6 months, he'd been reviewing Davis's cases, seeing this exact script play out again and again. Mrs. Rosa Delgado, 63, grandmother, accused Davis of calling her a slur during a traffic stop. Complaint, unsubstantiated. Jamal Washington, 17, honor student, alleged Davis planted drugs in his backpack. Complaint, unsubstantiated. Dr. Michael Johnson, prominent cardiologist, arrested outside his own home because Davis didn't believe a black man could live in that neighborhood. Complaint, unsubstantiated. 47 complaints over 15 years. Not a single one upheld. The defendant claims he was going to work, Davis made air quotes mockingly, but couldn't provide any employment verification, any identification, or any legitimate reason for being in a restricted area. If I may, Your Honor, Thompson stepped forward. The documents he was carrying had judicial letterhead, case numbers, sensitive information. We believe he may have been involved in identity theft or a fraud scheme. The irony was suffocating. Samuel was literally watching officers accuse him of stealing his own court documents, of impersonating himself. In my professional opinion, Davis concluded, this is simply another case of someone trying to manipulate the system. He knows if he makes this about race, about alleged police brutality, he can distract from his actual crimes. He turned to face Samuel directly, his eyes cold and contemptuous. These people think they can just walk into any building, any courtroom, demand respect they haven't earned. And when they're stopped, they scream discrimination. Well, not in my courthouse. Not on my watch. Asterisk my courthouse. My watch. Asterisk Samuel filed away every possessive phrase, every word that revealed how Davis truly saw his role, not as a public servant, but as a gatekeeper deciding who belonged and who didn't. Your Honor, Prosecutor Brennan added, the state recommends we proceed with charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, assault on a police officer, and possession of stolen documents. The defendant's attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is clearly a desperate defense strategy. Davis allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. This was going exactly as it always did. The system protected him, believed him, validated his every action. He'd testify, the defendant would protest, and justice, his version of justice, would prevail. Furthermore, Davis continued, emboldened, I want to emphasize the restraint I showed. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly under the influence of narcotics. A lesser officer might have used much more significant force. In the gallery, a young law clerk named Jennifer Williams frowned. Something about the defendant seemed familiar. The way he held himself, even handcuffed. The calm in his eyes despite the violence he'd endured. She'd seen that bearing before, but couldn't place where. Your professionalism is noted, Officer Davis, Judge Harrison said gravely. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Davis straightened his shoulders. Just that incidents like this remind us why we need strong law enforcement. Some people only understand authority when it's backed by force. The defendant learned today that actions have consequences. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove. Samuel sat quietly, observing the performance. In his 3 decades on the bench, he'd seen thousands of testimonies. He could recognize truth from fabrication, genuine confusion from calculated lies. Davis was good at this: the practiced pauses, the appeals to shared prejudices, the veneer of professionalism masking the rot underneath. But Davis had made a critical error. He'd gotten too comfortable, too confident in a system that had never held him accountable. He'd forgotten that justice wasn't just about who wore the uniform or who sat on the bench. Justice was about truth. And truth had a way of revealing itself, no matter how many lies tried to bury it. "The state rests its case against this defendant, Your Honor," Prosecutor Brennan announced. "The evidence clearly shows a pattern of criminal behavior and resistance to lawful authority." As Davis stepped down from the witness stand, he caught Samuel's eye one final time. He smirked, a gesture of complete dominance, total victory. It would be the last moment of triumph in his entire career. Samuel Harris had spent 6 months investigating systematic police misconduct. He'd reviewed hundreds of cases, interviewed dozens of victims, documented patterns of abuse that went back years. He'd worked with the FBI, the Department of Justice, the State Attorney General's office. And now, sitting in handcuffs with blood drying on his face, he was about to become the most important piece of evidence in his own investigation. "The defendant may now present his statement," Judge Harrison announced, his tone suggesting this would be a mere formality before sentencing. Samuel stood slowly, the handcuffs clinking softly. Despite the purple bruise spreading across his cheek and the disheveled state of his clothes, he carried himself with an unmistakable dignity that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. What none of them knew yet was that the real trial was about to begin. And Officer Davis had just convicted himself with his own testimony. Samuel Harris rose from the defendant's chair with the measured grace of someone who had done this thousands of times before, though usually from the other side of the courtroom. The handcuffs clinked softly as he straightened to his full height. "Thank you, Your Honor," his voice was clear, controlled, carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire room. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations." Judge Harrison blinked. Something in Samuel's tone was unexpected, professional in a way that didn't match the narrative he'd been presented. "Officer Davis has provided this court with a detailed account of this morning's events," Samuel began, his eyes sweeping methodically across the courtroom. "However, I'd like to clarify several significant factual inaccuracies in his testimony." The stenographer's fingers paused mid-stroke. Prosecutor Brennan frowned. This wasn't the rambling emotional outburst they'd expected from someone facing serious charges. "According to Officer Davis's statement, I was trespassing on government property and acting suspiciously. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 9:12 a.m. Samuel's voice remained steady, almost conversational. "Your Honor, I'm certain you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in Hague v. Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present." Several attorneys in the gallery sat up straighter. This wasn't typical defendant behavior. "Furthermore," Samuel continued, "Officer Davis testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely." He gestured toward the evidence table where his scattered papers had been collected. "Those documents are indeed authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files, judicial memoranda, and administrative correspondence. All of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity." "Professional capacity?" Judge Harrison interrupted. "And what exactly is your profession, mister?" Samuel paused, allowing the slightest smile to play at the corners of his mouth. "Harris. And I think we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor. If I may continue." Officer Davis felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. Something was very wrong with this picture. "Officer Davis also testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity," Samuel said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone completely comfortable in courtroom settings. "I'd like to address that claim by noting that any statements I made were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, warning, or legal justification. He turned slightly, addressing the entire courtroom now. The officer claimed his body camera malfunctioned. Convenient, isn't it? But here's something interesting about modern technology, Your Honor. This courthouse has comprehensive security camera coverage, high-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the main approach. Davis's face went pale. In his rush to control the narrative, he'd completely forgotten about the courthouse security system. Additionally, Samuel continued, the county maintains automatic backup systems for all officer body cam footage, regardless of claimed equipment malfunctions. These systems upload to cloud storage every 60 seconds. A detail Officer Davis appears to have overlooked. The young law clerk, Jennifer, suddenly gasped audibly. She'd placed where she'd seen that bearing before. The calm authority, the precise legal citations, the way he commanded the room even in handcuffs. Your Honor, Samuel said, I would like to formally request that this court issue a preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between 9:10 and 9:30 a.m., including courthouse security footage, body cam backup files, and any mobile phone recordings made by officers present. Objection. Prosecutor Brennan stood abruptly. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper legal representation. Samuel turned to face her with a look that made the prosecutor take an involuntary step backward. Your Honor, pro-se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment. Additionally, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's obligation to preserve potentially exculpatory evidence. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. This was not how these cases usually went. Judge Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Harris, you seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal legal training? I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor. Samuel's response was carefully neutral, but his eyes gleamed with something that looked almost like amusement. He walked as much as the handcuffs would allow toward the evidence table and gestured toward his scattered belongings. Your Honor, I'd also like to address Officer Davis's characterization of my presence here as suspicious or unauthorized. He pointed to a specific document among the papers. This is my daily court calendar, which shows I was scheduled to be in this building for legitimate business starting at 9 a.m. this morning. The bailiff, a large man named Thomas Henderson who'd worked in this courthouse for 12 years, suddenly went very still. He was staring at Samuel with growing recognition and mounting horror. Officer Davis testified that I claimed to be someone important, Samuel continued. I'd like to clarify that I never made any such claim during our encounter. However, I did attempt to show him my identification, which he refused to examine before initiating his assault. Samuel's voice grew quieter, more intense. Your Honor, I have in my possession, despite Officer Davis's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my identity and my legitimate reason for being at this courthouse this morning. Judge Harrison was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable. What kind of documentation? Samuel reached carefully into his jacket pocket, moving slowly to avoid startling anyone. My judicial parking pass, issued by this courthouse's administrative office. My building access card, programmed with entry codes. And my official identification. Bailiff Henderson suddenly stood up, his face draining of color as full recognition hit him like a freight train. Your Honor, Samuel said quietly, I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about who exactly Officer Davis assaulted this morning. He held up a leather credential wallet. Even from across the room, the gold judicial seal was unmistakable, catching the overhead lights. Perhaps, Samuel suggested, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who is used to giving orders in courtrooms, not taking them, we should take a brief recess so that proper identifications can be verified. Judge Harrison stared at the credential wallet, then at Samuel's face, then at Bailiff Henderson, who was nodding slowly, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The temporary judge's hand trembled as he reached for his gavel. Court will recess for 15 minutes. As the gavel fell, Officer Davis felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crack. The defendant he'd brutalized, the suspicious individual he'd so confidently testified against, was looking at him now with the calm certainty of someone who held all the cards. And for the first time in 15 years, Davis understood what it felt like to be powerless. During the recess, the courthouse exploded with nervous energy. Bailiff Henderson rushed to Samuel with fumbling hands, working to remove the handcuffs. "Judge Harris," he whispered, his voice thick with horror and disbelief. "Sir, I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you without. When they brought you in like that, I never thought." "It's all right, Thomas," Samuel replied softly, rubbing his wrists where the metal had bitten into skin. "You weren't part of this. But I need you to do something for me. Anything, Your Honor. Anything at all. Go to my chambers. Quietly. Bring my judicial robes, the ones with the gold trim. And Thomas." Samuel looked him directly in the eye. "Bring my gavel. The engraved one for my swearing-in ceremony." Henderson nodded vigorously and hurried out, his footsteps echoing down the marble corridor. Left alone in the small holding room, Samuel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. 30 years on the bench. Thousands of cases. Hundreds of officers who'd testified before him. And somehow, he'd known this moment would come eventually. For 6 months, he'd been working with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, documenting patterns of abuse in the local police department. He'd reviewed arrest records, conviction rates, use of force reports. He'd seen the names that appeared again and again in complaints that mysteriously went nowhere. Officer Davis. 43 cases. 47 complaints. All dismissed as unsubstantiated. Until today. Samuel's phone, confiscated during the arrest but now hastily returned, buzzed with increasingly frantic messages. His clerk had been calling for hours. His colleagues were worried. Word was beginning to spread that something unprecedented had happened. He typed a quick message to Chief Judge Margaret Patterson. "Margaret, I need you to secure all surveillance footage from this morning. Courthouse cameras, body cam backups, everything. And Margaret, contact the FBI field office. Tell them we have our test case." The reply came within seconds. "My God, Samuel. Are you all right? What happened?" "Justice happened," Samuel typed back. Finally. Henderson returned carrying a garment bag and a polished wooden box. "Your robes, sir. And your gavel." Samuel stood and unzipped the bag, revealing the flowing black judicial robes that had been his armor for 3 decades. As he slipped them on, he felt the transformation complete. The fabric settled on his shoulders like a mantle of authority, each fold a reminder of the power he wielded, the oaths he had taken, the justice he was sworn to protect. He opened the wooden box and lifted out his ceremonial gavel. Its weight was familiar and comforting in his hand. Engraved on the handle were words chosen carefully 30 years ago: "Justice delayed is justice denied." "Thomas," Samuel said, adjusting his robes in the small mirror. "When we return to that courtroom, I want you to announce me properly." "Yes, Your Honor." "How would you like to be announced?" Samuel Harris straightened to his full height, every inch the federal judge he had been for 30 years. The bruise on his cheek was still visible, still painful, but now it served a different purpose. It wasn't just evidence of Davis's brutality. It was a symbol of how far the system had fallen, and how completely it was about to be restored. "The Honorable Judge Samuel Harris," he said quietly. "Presiding." He looked at himself in the mirror one final time. The swelling on his face, the blood dried at the corner of his mouth, the dignity that no amount of violence could strip away. "Officer Davis wanted to teach me about consequences," Samuel said softly. "I think it's time he learned that lesson himself." The 15 minutes were up. It was time to take back his courtroom. "All rise." Bailiff Henderson's voice boomed through the courtroom with an authority that made everyone snap to attention. But what happened next would be seared into their memories forever. "Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Samuel Harris presiding." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Officer Davis, who had been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, went rigid. Judge Harrison, still seated in what he now realized was not his chair, turned pale as death. Prosecutor Brennan's mouth fell open in shock. Samuel Harris entered through the judge's chamber door, wearing his full judicial robes, the gold trim catching the overhead lights. He moved with the measured pace of someone who had walked this path thousands of times before. In his right hand, he carried his ceremonial gavel. The silence was absolute. Not a single person dared to breathe. He took his place behind the bench, and sat down slowly, deliberately. His eyes swept the courtroom, taking in every shocked face, every dropped jaw, every person who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. "Officer Davis," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority. "You may remain standing." Davis looked like he might collapse. His face had gone from red to white to green in the span of seconds. "Judge Harrison," Samuel continued, his tone measured but firm. "Thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own docket. I'll handle this matter from here." Harrison practically fled from the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him. Samuel turned his attention to Davis, who was now visibly trembling. "Officer Davis, approximately 2 hours ago, you provided testimony under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" Davis couldn't form words. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "Let me refresh your memory," Samuel continued. "You stated, and I quote, 'These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability.' Do you remember saying that?" Davis managed a weak nod. "You also stated that I was, quote, 'clearly attempting to circumvent security protocols and that you used, quote, minimum necessary force.' Is that accurate?" The courtroom remained deathly silent. "And perhaps most memorably," Samuel's voice grew colder, "you stated that people like me need to learn our place. That this was your courthouse. Your watch. Do you recall those particular pieces of wisdom, Officer Davis?" Davis's legs were shaking so hard he could barely stand. Samuel reached beneath his bench and pulled out a tablet computer. "Officer Davis, I'd like to show you some evidence that has just come to my attention." He turned the tablet screen toward the courtroom. On it was crystal-clear security camera footage from the courthouse steps, showing the entire morning's incident from multiple angles. "This is footage from Courthouse Security Camera 7, which has an unobstructed view of the main entrance." Samuel touched the screen, starting the video. The courtroom watched in horror as the events unfolded. There was Samuel, walking calmly toward the courthouse in his civilian clothes. There was Davis blocking his path. And then the assault began. "Animals like you don't belong here." Davis's voice, clear as day, filled the courtroom through the tablet speakers. Several people gasped audibly. The video continued, showing the unprovoked violence in vivid detail, the slap that snapped Samuel's head sideways, the brutal grab, the handcuffs, the mockery. But the most damning moment was yet to come. These people think they can walk into any building, any courtroom. Well, not in MY Courthouse. Samuel paused the video. "Officer Davis, do you see any verbal aggression from me in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats?" Davis remained silent, his career disintegrating before his eyes. "Now," Samuel continued, "let's examine your claim that your body camera malfunctioned." He swiped to a new file. "This is backup footage from your own body camera, automatically uploaded to the county's cloud storage system every 60 seconds, a system you apparently forgot existed." The new video began playing, and Davis's voice filled the courtroom again. "Look at this one trying to act important. Time to teach another lesson about knowing your place." Prosecutor Brennan was frantically gathering her papers, trying to distance herself from the catastrophe. "Officer Rodriguez, Officer Thompson," Samuel called out. "You both testified under oath that Officer Davis handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. Would you like to revise those statements?" Both officers were already edging toward the exit. "For the record," Samuel said, his voice taking on a judicial formality, "I am Judge Samuel Harris. I have served as the presiding judge of this courthouse for 30 years. Every case Officer Davis has testified in, every warrant he's requested, every arrest he's made in this jurisdiction has been under my authority." Davis finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know." "You didn't know?" Samuel repeated slowly. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You saw an elderly black man and you made assumptions. You saw someone you thought was powerless, and you decided to abuse that power." He leaned forward slightly. "But there's something else you didn't know, Officer Davis." The courtroom held its breath. "For the past 6 months, I've been conducting an investigation into patterns of misconduct and racial bias in this police department, working directly with the FBI's Civil Rights Division." Davis's face went completely white. This morning's incident wasn't just random, Officer Davis. You've been under investigation. And you just provided us with the most perfect, undeniable evidence we could have hoped for. Samuel lifted a thick file onto his bench. This file contains records of every case you've testified in over the past 5 years. 43 cases. In 28 of those cases, the defendants were people of color. And in your testimony, Officer Davis, you used remarkably similar language to what you used with me this morning. He opened the file. Rosa Delgado, age 63, grandmother. You called her a slur during a traffic stop. Complaint dismissed as unsubstantiated. Jamal Washington, age 17, honor student. You allegedly planted drugs on him. Complaint dismissed. Dr. Michael Johnson, prominent cardiologist, arrested outside his own home. Complaint dismissed. Samuel looked up from the file. 47 complaints over 15 years, Officer Davis. Every single one dismissed as unsubstantiated. Until today. He set down the file. Today, there are witnesses. Today, there are cameras. Today, there is undeniable evidence. And today, Officer Davis, you assaulted a federal judge while he was performing his official duties. Samuel lifted his gavel. You told me this morning that actions have consequences. You are absolutely right about that. The gavel came down with the sound of thunder. Officer Davis, based on the evidence presented, evidence that came from your own mouth, your own actions, your own cameras, I find you guilty of assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. Davis's knees buckled. He grabbed the prosecutor's table to keep from falling. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. I find you guilty of perjury in the first degree for the false testimony you provided in this courtroom. Samuel paused, letting the weight of those charges settle over the room. But this case was never really about you, Officer Davis. You're simply a symptom of a much larger disease that has infected our justice system for far too long. He turned to address the packed gallery. For too long, we have allowed officers to operate with impunity. For too long, we have dismissed complaints, ignored evidence, paid settlements while allowing abuse to continue. For too long, we have told victims that their experiences don't matter, that their word doesn't count, that justice isn't for them. His voice rose with passion. But that ends today. What happened in this courtroom proves that no one is above the law. Davis finally broke down completely, his body shaking with sobs. Officer Davis, Samuel said quietly, your apology comes 15 years and 47 complaints too late. Your remorse only appeared because you finally got caught by someone with the power to hold you accountable. He lifted his gavel high. Today, I'm not just delivering justice for myself. I'm delivering justice for every person whose complaints were dismissed. For every family who watched their loved ones get brutalized while the system looked away. For every Rosa Delgado, every Jamal Washington, every Dr. Johnson who was told their word didn't matter. The gavel hovered in the air. Officer Davis, you told me to know my place. Let me tell you what my place is. My place is ensuring that officers like you can never again hide behind a badge while destroying innocent lives. The gavel came down with finality. You are hereby remanded into custody pending sentencing. Bail is denied. I am also ordering a federal investigation into every case you have touched, every arrest you have made. The victims you have silenced will finally have their day in court. Samuel looked out over the courtroom. Let this be a message to every official who thinks they can abuse their power without consequences. Justice may be blind, but she sees everything. And eventually, she comes for everyone. The courtroom erupted in applause that lasted for 5 full minutes. Justice had finally been served. 6 months later, the ripple effects of that historic morning continued to transform the entire justice system. Officer Davis was serving his sentence in federal prison, where his fellow inmates had learned about his crimes through extensive news coverage. His badge, his pension, his freedom, all gone. The man who once terrorized an entire community now understood, finally, what it felt like to be powerless. But Davis's downfall was just the beginning. Judge Samuel Harris sat in his chambers, now fully restored to his rightful position, reviewing the final report from the federal investigation. The numbers told a story that was both horrifying and vindicating. 12 officers terminated. 4 supervisors criminally charged. The entire police department placed under federal oversight for the next 5 years. Mandatory body cameras with tamper-proof backup systems. Automatic federal review of any misconduct allegations involving judicial personnel. But the number that mattered most to Samuel was this one: 432. 432 cases that had been tainted by Officer Davis's misconduct were reopened. Dozens of wrongfully convicted defendants released from prison. Hundreds more had their charges dropped or sentences reduced. The county paid out $8.7 million in compensation to Davis's victims, money that came directly from the police department's budget, ensuring the institution itself felt the cost of its failures. A knock on his chamber door interrupted Samuel's thoughts. "Come in." Bailiff Henderson entered, followed by a young woman Samuel recognized immediately. Rosa Delgado, now 69, the grandmother Davis had assaulted during a traffic stop 15 years ago. Her complaint had been dismissed as unsubstantiated within 48 hours. "Mrs. Delgado," Samuel stood, extending his hand warmly. "Thank you for coming." "Judge Harris," her voice trembled slightly. "I wanted to thank you. For 30 years, I've been telling anyone who would listen what that man did to me. My own family started to think I was exaggerating, that maybe I had misremembered. But you believed me. The system finally believed me." Samuel gestured for her to sit. "Mrs. Delgado, I owe you an apology. Your complaint came through this courthouse. It should never have been dismissed. The system failed you long before I had the evidence to prove it." She shook her head firmly. "Judge Harris, you gave me something more valuable than an apology. You gave me vindication. You proved I wasn't crazy, wasn't lying, wasn't exaggerating. My grandchildren know now that their abuela was telling the truth all along." After she left, Samuel stood at his window overlooking the courthouse steps where Davis had assaulted him. A bronze plaque had been installed there 3 months ago, its inscription simple but powerful: "Here, justice finally found its voice." His phone buzzed with a text from Chief Judge Margaret Patterson: "Conference room in 10 minutes. The Attorney General wants to discuss expanding the investigation statewide." But before heading to the meeting, Samuel had one more visitor. Dr. Michael Johnson, the cardiologist Davis had arrested outside his own home 6 years ago, entered the chambers with quiet dignity. He was followed by Jamal Washington, now 23, who'd been just 17 when Davis allegedly planted drugs in his backpack. "Gentlemen," Samuel greeted them. "Please sit." "Judge Harris," Dr. Johnson began, "we wanted you to know that we've started a foundation. The Davis Accountability Project. We're working with wrongfully accused individuals across the state, helping them navigate the legal system, documenting patterns of misconduct." Jamal nodded enthusiastically. "We've already identified 3 other officers with patterns similar to Davis. We're building cases, collecting evidence, finding victims who were too scared to come forward before." Samuel felt a surge of pride. That's exactly what needs to happen. The system can't police itself. It needs witnesses, advocates, people willing to shine light into dark corners. "We learned from you, Judge Harris," Dr. Johnson said quietly. "You showed us that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about transformation. About making sure this never happens again." After they left, Samuel sat alone in his chambers, thinking about the strange path that had led to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been handcuffed, beaten, humiliated. 6 months ago, Officer Davis had thought he'd successfully neutralized another troublemaker. Instead, Davis had assaulted the one person who had both the power and the evidence to expose everything. The universe, Samuel reflected, had a profound sense of irony. That evening, Samuel spoke at a packed law school auditorium. Students, professors, civil rights attorneys, and community activists filled every seat. The topic: When Justice Wears Handcuffs, Reforming Police Accountability from Within. 6 months ago, Samuel began, I experienced something that thousands of Americans experience every year. I was profiled, assaulted, and falsely accused by a police officer who saw my skin color before he saw my humanity. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. The only difference between my story and thousands of others is that I had power. I had a platform. I had the ability to hold my attacker accountable. He paused, letting that sink in. But what about everyone who doesn't have that power? What about Rosa Delgado, Jamal Washington, Dr. Johnson, and the hundreds of others whose complaints were dismissed as unsubstantiated? Samuel's voice grew stronger. That's why this case was never just about me. It was about proving that the system can change. That accountability is possible. That justice, however delayed, can still be delivered. A young black woman in the front row raised her hand. Judge Harris, some people say you were lucky. That if you hadn't been a judge, Officer Davis would have gotten away with it like he had 46 times before. Doesn't that prove the system is still broken? Samuel nodded slowly. You're absolutely right. The system is still broken. But here's what that morning proved. It can be fixed. Not by hoping bad officers will suddenly become good people, but by creating systems that make abuse impossible to hide. He gestured to the screen behind him, showing the courthouse security camera footage that had sealed Davis's fate. Every police encounter should be recorded. Every body camera should have tamper-proof backups. Every complaint should be investigated by independent reviewers, not by the department investigating itself. Every victim should be believed until proven otherwise, not dismissed until proven true. The audience erupted in applause. But most importantly, Samuel continued when the room quieted, we need to remember that badges don't make people trustworthy. Uniforms don't make people honorable. Authority doesn't make people just. Those qualities come from character, from accountability, from systems that reward truth and punish abuse. After the speech, as Samuel was leaving, a young officer approached him hesitantly. Judge Harris, I'm Officer Williams. I've been on the force for 2 years. I wanted you to know that what happened to you, it changed things for some of us. Not all of us, but some. We're trying to be better. To call out the bad behavior when we see it. Samuel shook his hand firmly. That's all any of us can do, Officer Williams. Try to be better. Hold each other accountable. Remember that the uniform is a responsibility, not a shield. 1 year after the incident, the courthouse held a ceremony. The building was officially renamed the Samuel Harris Justice Center. Samuel had protested, arguing that his name shouldn't be on a building, but Chief Judge Patterson had overruled him. This isn't about ego, Samuel, she'd said. It's about sending a message. This building stands for justice that doesn't look away. Justice that doesn't dismiss complaints. Justice that holds everyone accountable, no matter what uniform they wear. At the dedication ceremony, Samuel stood before a crowd of hundreds. His children were there, his grandchildren, his colleagues. Rosa Delgado sat in the front row beside Dr. Johnson and Jamal Washington. The Davis Accountability Project had grown to include 47 victims of police misconduct, all of whom now had their voices heard. When I was handcuffed on those steps, Samuel said, gesturing to where the new plaque now hung, I learned something important. Justice isn't just a concept. It's not just a word we engrave on buildings. Justice is a choice we make every single day. He looked directly at the cameras recording the event, knowing his words would reach far beyond this audience. To everyone watching who has been dismissed, ignored, or told their complaints don't matter, I see you. Your experiences are valid. Your truth matters. And the system that failed you can be changed. Samuel's voice grew firmer. To every officer who thinks the badge makes you untouchable, it doesn't. The system that protected corruption for so long is being dismantled. Accountability is coming. Choose now whether you'll be part of the solution or another cautionary tale. And to everyone who works within the justice system, judges, prosecutors, clerks, bailiffs, remember that we are the gatekeepers. When we look away from abuse, we become complicit in it. When we dismiss complaints without investigation, we enable the next victim. Our silence is not neutrality. It's collaboration. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Samuel returned to the courthouse steps. He stood where Davis had assaulted him, where his blood had stained the marble, where his dignity had been tested and proven unbreakable. A young girl, no more than 10 years old, approached with her mother. "Are you the judge who got arrested?" she asked with the blunt honesty of childhood. Samuel smiled. "I am. My teacher says you're a hero." Samuel knelt down to her level. "I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I'm just someone who refused to accept injustice. And you know what? You can do that too. You can stand up when something is wrong. You can speak truth even when it's uncomfortable. You can demand that the people with power use it responsibly. The girl nodded seriously. I will. As Samuel watched her walk away with her mother, he felt something settle in his chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but purpose. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. Every day brought new cases, new challenges, new opportunities for the system to fail or to succeed. But on that courthouse step, where injustice had once triumphed, now stood a testament to the possibility of change. If this story moved you, if you believe that justice should be blind to everything except the truth, then share it. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see more stories proving that accountability is possible, that systems can change, that speaking truth to power still matters. Because stories like this happen every day, and they all deserve to be heard. Samuel Harris had learned a profound truth that morning 6 months ago. Sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to be broken. Sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom or a gavel. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to stand up and say, not today. Not to me. Not anymore. And sometimes, justice wears handcuffs just long enough to remind everyone what it looks like when the truth finally breaks free.